We return now to that trial of a group of St. Louis police officers that we told you about earlier. Detective Luther Hall was undercover at a protest in September of 2017 when he was attacked. 3 fellow officers, all white, were charged with beating him. Their trial ended yesterday in a combination of mistrials and not guilty verdicts. Following this story for us now is investigative reporter Lauren Trager with our St. Louis affiliate. Thank you so much for joining us again. Lauren, wow. So walk us through what happened yesterday and how the jury came to the decisions they came to.
Well, thank you again, first of all, for having me. Certainly a very dramatic and emotional end to this particular trial. The jury deliberated much of the day on Friday and then came back yesterday and continued their deliberations for, again, much of the day. So for a lot of the day, we didn't hear anything at all. And then late in the afternoon, the jury did come back and tell the judge that they had reached essentially a partial verdict. So they were able to reach decisions on some of the charges, but not on all of them. So you're seeing some of those defendants there. 2 of them are former St. Louis police officers. 1 of them is still a current St. Louis police officer. And it did end in sort of a mixed bag. One of them, Dustin Boone, his trial ended in a mistrial. The jury foreman came forward and said, "Judge, we simply cannot deliberate anymore. We cannot reach a decision in this charge. So we have reached a stalemate," and his case was declared a mistrial. As you're seeing there on your screen now, Stephen Cordy, he was completely cleared of the charges. He was facing 2 counts and he was found not guilty. And then the 3rd officer, Christopher Myers, sort of a mixed bag as well there, where he was found not guilty of the beating itself, but a mistrial in whether or not he destroyed evidence. Then, of course, there was a lot of reaction from both sides, certainly some tears. Those officers, you could see just the palpable relief on their face when this decidedly in their favor verdicts came back. And then also some people very emotional on the other side, hoping for a very different outcome, wanting justice for Luther Hall that at this particular point they don't have.
So give us a sense of just what some of the evidence was that was presented at trial. I understand there were some damning text messages that were read out loud. What do we know about those? Who sent those messages? What did they say?
Certainly, this was a case about the evidence, and the prosecutors here tried to make it very clear to the jury that they needed to weigh all of the evidence in aggregate. Unlike a very high-profile trial that you guys have been covering, there is no clear video of the incident itself. Luther Hall was acting as if he was a protester that day, so he was rolling video on his own cell phone, but once the incident started happening, it fell to the ground. You can't really see anything. And then there were really dozens of photographs of the aftermath and the arrest itself, but nothing that was very clear in showing who exactly did the beating itself. As you mentioned, the prosecution really brought forward those text messages, though. There were some texts from those officers exchanged indicating even before the protest began that they wanted to beat up protesters that night. And then another critical piece of evidence here was a text message from Dustin Boone after the fact to Luther Hall saying he wanted to apologize for what happened, saying no words could make it right, but that he wanted to face him like a man and apologize. The prosecutor saying, apologize for what? That would be evidence that he, in fact, participated in that beating. The defense, though, saying those text messages were all taken out of context, that words are not the same as actions. And the defense, again, over and over saying there was just not enough evidence to prove that it was, in fact, those officers that hurt Luther Hall. They didn't deny that Luther Hall got hurt, and perhaps wrongfully, but they were trying to prove that it wasn't those officers who participated.
Very interesting, because of course there were 2 other officers involved in the incident, 5 total implicated, but those 2 other officers pleaded guilty. So they were not defendants in this trial. I believe at least one, though, did testify in the trial. Did their guilty pleas play a role? I guess that was one of the ways in which their guilty pleas played a role in their testimony.
Yeah, that's right. One of those officers, her name is Bailey Coletta, she pleaded guilty only to lying to the FBI. So her situation was a little bit ancillary to everything that happened. The other officer, former officer Randy Hayes, he pleaded guilty to the assault itself, and he took the stand in this trial and acknowledged that he, in fact, did hit Luther Hall 3 to 5 times. But he said that he also saw Stephen Corty kick Luther Hall and saw Christopher Myers nearby. So his testimony was key to the prosecution in trying to name the other officers. However, the defense, again, really hitting on that, saying that Randy Hayes had not been sentenced yet in federal court, that perhaps he was just seeking a more lenient sentence, that he in fact was lying, is what the defense said, and that he was the only one who was naming some of these officers, particularly Stephen Corti, as being the actual assailants. That may or may not be the case, and that was what the defense was saying, that he was the only one to see that. So they really tried to discredit him. He is still awaiting sentence. He does not have any type of plea agreement with the federal court at this particular time, although, as we know, sometimes in agreement for testimony, there can be a more lenient sentence. So his testimony was pretty critical in this case. Ultimately, though, the jury not necessarily weighing him, obviously, in their verdicts.
I'm glad that you pointed out that one of the officers that pleaded guilty had to do with lying, because part of the situation with this case is not just the incident that happened, but the way in which officers are accused of misleading or in other ways frustrating the investigation. And that is also part of the criticism that comes from the community when it comes to, a need to revisit policing, that sometimes police close ranks, and it's very difficult to root out bad behavior if they are sort of protecting each other. So then what's next? In terms of a verdict, appeal, charges being refiled, what does it look like?
Well, certainly for those not guilty verdicts, that's the end. As we know, there's double jeopardy that would apply here. So for Stephen Corti especially, he gets to walk free now and not face any additional charges unless new information is brought forward, obviously. There are those 2 mistrial counts, though, and the prosecution could decide whether or not they want to bring forward a new case. That remains to be seen. Obviously, this was a 2-week-long trial, very difficult to even get a jury seated. It took some time to do that. So we will see if the prosecution decides to move forward still on those 2 cases. As you mentioned, a lot of community reaction from this, and what really remains to be seen is, will there be any systemic changes that come from this? A lot of people obviously say we had a problem here when we had one of our own, an undercover Black detective who's been dedicated to the police department for many, many years. When he was injured in this, do we need to make changes? And as you can see, there are some members of our community. One is a mayoral candidate, the current treasurer. She is vowing in her race for mayor to make changes to the police department. The union that represents African-American police officers, they came out with a very strong statement, as well as some activists who were at the trial yesterday, very emotional by the outcome of this, saying there is simply a different criminal justice system for Black people versus white people. And certainly they felt that this is a different system for even a Black officer, that this case really highlights some of the issues that we are dealing with, not only in the St. Louis region, but truly all around the country.
Indeed. Investigative reporter Lauren Trager with our St. Louis affiliate, KMOV. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.